Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Story 1. Saw them watching me in the dark.
When I was about 12 or 13 years old, I went through a strange period of sleepwalking. Sometimes I would recall fragments of it, but other times my mother or sister would tell me they had seen me wandering the house at night and had to guide me back to bed. One particular night remains etched in my memory. I woke up on our living room sofa, surrounded by complete darkness. Confused, I tried to piece together how I had gotten there, as I had gone to sleep in my bed upstairs. Our living room connected to the dining area, and as I sat up, my eyes adjusted to the darkness. That was when I noticed them. Silhouettes, motionless figures seated around the dining table. A cold wave of fear washed over me, but for some inexplicable reason, I felt drawn toward them. I slowly stood up and took a few hesitant steps forward. As I got closer, the figures became clearer. They were cloaked in long black robes, their hoods pulled low over their faces, which were nothing but absolute darkness, voids where features should have been. They resembled the wraiths from the Lord of the Rings, shrouded in an unsettling stillness. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake myself from what felt like a nightmare, yet my body refused to listen. My breathing became shallow as I stared at them, and then one of them moved. Its hooded head slowly turned towards me. The moment its faceless void fixed upon me, an unbearable dread crashed over me like a tidal wave. That was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. My instincts took over, and I bolted, running up the stairs as fast as I could. My voice broke through the silence of the house as I called for my mother, shouting that there were people downstairs. She rushed to my side, and together, we cautiously made our way back down. My heart pounded as she switched on the light. The room was empty. The chairs were neatly pushed under the table, as if nothing had ever been there at all. I have told this story many times, but no one has ever been able to explain it. I have considered that I might have still been in a dream state, projecting a nightmare into reality. However, as I have grown older, I have also wondered about alternate dimensions. Was I glimpsing into another world, or did something from beyond momentarily slip into ours? Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: it was an experience I will never forget.
Story 2. Trapped beneath the sofa.
This was the third encounter with the third entity. This time the victim was my cousin. It happened almost 7 to 8 years after the last encounter. By this point, my uncle had sadly passed away due to an illness. Now, only my aunt, her son, her brother-in-law, and his family wife and 2 children lived in the house. My aunt's brother-in-law had a night shift at work, so he asked my cousin, a 22-year-old man at the time, to ensure all the doors were properly locked after he left for work. At around 11:30 at night, my cousin came downstairs and began securing the house. As he was locking the front gate, he suddenly noticed 2 hands clutching the railing from the outside, covered in thick white fur. He could not see the full figure, but he was certain it was a tall humanoid being standing beyond the gate, with only its forearms visible, resting just above his own hands as he worked the lock. Terror overtook him. Inside the house, my aunt's sister-in-law was putting her daughter to sleep when she heard a loud scream. Thinking it was her son causing mischief, she rushed out to scold him. Instead, she found my cousin crammed beneath the living room sofa. Most sofas have very little space between the floor and the bottom, barely a few inches. Yet, there he was, a grown man, trembling, sweating, and chattering his teeth in absolute fear. It is unclear whether he crawled under the sofa himself out of terror, or something forced him there. For the next 2 to 3 days, he suffered from a high fever and remained in a delirious state. At the peak of his illness, he repeatedly tried to leave the house, rushing toward the door in an almost trance-like state. He had to be physically restrained multiple times. Eventually, the fever broke and his mind cleared. That was the final straw for my aunt. She decided they could not go on living in fear any longer. Experts were consulted, and within the next few months the entire house was exorcised. In our culture, this ritual is called a binding. It creates an invisible barrier along the property's perimeter, preventing any non-human entities from entering. As far as I know, there have been no further disturbances or sightings since.
Story 3. When the Dead Wake Me Up.
For as long as I can remember, my sleep has been haunted by something I cannot explain. It always starts the same way during the day. I recall someone from my past, someone I once knew in real life. Then, at night, I am awakened by an overwhelming presence. Last night was no different. I was deep in sleep when a horrifying dream jolted me awake. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to shake off the lingering fear. But then, something happened that was far worse than any nightmare. I felt it. A hand, cold, firm, and undeniably real, pressed against the left side of my ribs. It was not a harsh shove, but a slow, deliberate touch, as if someone were pressing their fingers into my skin just enough to be felt. A shiver ran down my spine as my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but before I could even process what was happening, my blanket moved. Not just a shift, not just a slight ripple, it was pushed. I watched in horror as it slid across my body, as if an invisible force had taken hold of it. The realization hit me like a wave of ice. The person I had remembered that day, the one now in my dreams, was no longer alive. This was not the first time. This entity, this presence, had made a habit of disturbing my sleep. Sometimes, I would wake up feeling a sudden pressure on my legs, as if unseen fingers were gripping my toes. Other times, it would press against my body, an unmistakable sign that I was not alone in my room. But last night was different. Last night it felt more real than ever before. It was no longer just a touch. It was an interaction. It was trying to make itself known. I do not know what it wants. I do not know why it refuses to leave me alone. All I know is that when I close my eyes, I am no longer just sleeping. I am waiting for it to return.
Story 4. Haunting at the vet clinic.
Most people would not think a veterinary clinic could be haunted. But if humans can return after death, why not animals? I have worked at this clinic for about 3 years, and I have had enough encounters to know I am not alone here. When I first started, we had a clinic cat named Oliver, or Ollie for short. He roamed the halls freely after appointments were over, keeping the night crew company. Sadly, Ollie passed away, but I have seen him since. One night around 2 a.m., I was walking toward the pharmacy when I saw a cat dart around a corner. I sighed, assuming one of the animals had jiggled their cage door open again. But when I turned the corner, there was nothing. I checked rooms, cabinets, everywhere. No cat. Finally, I rushed to my co-worker, stressed. She glanced at me, confused, and pointed. "What do you mean?" "Ollie is right there, sleeping." Sure enough, there he was, curled up in his locked cage, fast asleep. That was not the last time I saw something unnatural. On the 4th of July, the clinic was closed, but someone still had to care for the animals. It was just me and one other co-worker. I had half the hospital to myself. a massive building with 2 stories and endless hallways. I walked out of a room and froze. To my left was the X-ray room, and something was there. A solid black figure wrapped itself around the door frame. It had long, unnatural fingers gripping the frame, as if it were holding itself up. It had no face, but I felt it staring at me. It stood there, unmoving, like a child playing a terrible game of hide and seek. I do not know how long I stood there, but suddenly it coiled its body back into the room. I had no choice but to walk past it. My heart pounded as I glanced inside, hoping to see my coworker, but the room was empty. Since that night, I have seen it in different parts of the clinic. I choose to ignore it, but something dark is here, and it is watching.
Story 5. Trapped in a haunting memory.
It was a quiet December night, and I was alone in the kitchen baking Christmas cookies. The warm glow of the oven flickered, and the scent of vanilla and cinnamon filled the air. Everything felt normal until it didn't. As I reached for the flour, a strange dizziness washed over me. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to faint. But when my sight cleared, I was no longer in my kitchen. The back door was gone. The countertops, the cabinets, everything had changed. In its place stood an old-fashioned kitchen with wooden paneling, a cozy breakfast nook, and a large mural on the wall that I had never seen before. My heart pounded as I turned and saw a woman and 2 young boys sitting at the table, chatting and laughing as they ate breakfast. I took a shaky step forward. "Hello." My voice sounded small, uncertain. They ignored me. I called out again, louder this time. Nothing. Panic set in. I yelled, waving my arms. Still, they carried on, completely unaware of my presence. It was as if I did not exist. A terrifying thought gripped me. Was I trapped here? Had I somehow slipped into another time? My breathing grew shallow. Then, as suddenly as it began, the vision shattered. I was back in my modern kitchen. The back door was in its place, my ingredients untouched on the counter. But the air felt colder, heavier. Shaken, I grabbed my phone and called my landlord. I hesitated before explaining what had just happened, expecting disbelief. But his response chilled me to my core. "Oh," he said with an eerie familiarity. "Mom must have wanted you to see how happy our little family was." I hung up without another word, my skin crawling. The house had always felt strange, but now I knew something or someone still lingered there. And for reasons beyond my understanding, they had let me see a piece of their past. Or maybe they wanted me to be part of it.
Story 6. The Dolls of the Forgotten Farmhouse.
In the 1950s, my grandparents lived in an old farmhouse in South Jersey. The house was built long before the American Revolution, and with its age came an eerie atmosphere that none of the family could explain. My grandparents, parents, and 2 brothers lived there, but it was my mother who experienced the most unsettling events. The farmhouse had an attic, which my mother claimed as her personal space for playing. She would set up elaborate tea parties with her dolls, leaving the room a mess whenever she was done. As she grew older, the days seemed long, filled with chores and little time to revisit her toys. But when she would go back to the attic, something unnerving would happen. The dolls were no longer scattered around the room, their faces frozen in expressions of sorrow and joy. Instead, they were neatly placed in their seats, the tea set carefully set on the table, everything exactly where it was the day before. No one in the family had gone up to tidy the attic. My grandfather, who spent his time working hard on the farm, had no interest in cleaning up her mess. Her older brother was more interested in cars and girls, and the youngest brother was just a toddler. The idea that someone else had come up to fix things was absurd. But the eerie events didn't stop there. Some nights my mother would feel a chill as she played alone, her dolls staring at her with unblinking eyes. At times she could hear soft footsteps echoing through the attic, like someone else was moving about though no one else was home. There were even moments when she would hear a gentle whisper, just faint enough to make her skin crawl, calling her name from the dark corners of the room. But when she looked around, there was no one there. The farmhouse stood on nearly 20 acres of land, a place full of history and memories. But eventually, the house was torn down to make room for a shopping mall in the early 1960s. My mother said that the presence in the attic had vanished the day the house was demolished, but she would never forget the eerie sensation that someone had been watching her play.
Story 7. Chilled to the bone.
One evening, my mum, my sister and I were all in the kitchen, the air heavy with the usual sounds of a quiet household. I stood at the counter, casually making a bowl of cereal, while my sister was behind the kitchen table. My mum, busy near the stove, glanced over at us as we talked, the warmth of the kitchen contrasting the unsettling silence of the night. It felt like a regular evening, the kind where nothing out of the ordinary happens, or so we thought. Suddenly, without warning, something impossible occurred. The milk cap, which had been resting on the counter beside me, flew off with a sudden force. It didn't just fall, it was as if something or someone had propelled it through the air with unnatural speed. It soared across the kitchen and struck my sister with a sharp thud. She whipped around, her face filled with confusion and anger. "Why did you just throw that at me?" she snapped, her voice shaking with disbelief. I spun around, my heart racing, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. "I didn't throw anything at you. How could I?" My back was turned the whole time. There was a moment of stillness, the kind of silence that seems too heavy, too thick. We all stood frozen, staring at each other, the reality of the situation sinking in. My mum, who had seen the entire event unfold, was just as stunned. None of us had touched the milk cap. None of us had moved a muscle. Yet there it was, the milk cap lying on the floor where my sister had been standing. The kitchen, once warm and comforting, now felt like a cold, oppressive space. The air seemed to pulse, heavy with the unseen. We could hear the faint sound of a creaking floorboard, as though something was moving just out of sight, watching us. But there was no one else there. To this day, we have no explanation for what happened that night. Whatever force moved that milk cap didn't want us to forget. And as the nights passed, we began to sense its presence, lingering just beyond our sight, waiting for the next time it would strike.
Story 8. Curse of the FNAF doll.
I used to be skeptical about the paranormal, until one night when I experienced something that I'll never forget. It all started when I was 14 years old. I loved collecting plushies, especially those from my favorite franchises. One evening, while I was on the phone with my friend, she mentioned she had a Five Nights at Freddy's doll she no longer wanted. I was thrilled and agreed to take it, thinking it would be a great addition to my collection. Minutes after hanging up, I heard a knock on the door. To my surprise, G had ridden her bike all the way to my house to deliver the doll. When I opened the door, I was confused but smiled and thanked her. The doll she gave me was a Ballora plush from the game. It looked strange, with its white fabric tarnished and grimy, as though it had been through hell. A musty smell clung to it, reminding me of an old house. I decided to wash it, but even after 3 washes, the smell and stains wouldn't fade. I placed it on top of my large TV stand, supported by a box of Beanie Babies. A few days later, strange things started happening. At first it was subtle. Small items would move on their own, or a shelf would break for no reason. I felt strange tingling sensations on my fingertips, though I didn't understand it at the time. One evening, while eating dinner and talking to G on FaceTime, something unbelievable occurred. The doll flew off the TV stand and landed perfectly in my McDonald's bag. I froze in terror, staring at the bag in disbelief. G noticed my reaction and asked if I was okay. When I explained, she was just as freaked out as I was. But the activity didn't stop there. Late one night, while I was in bed, the mattress suddenly lifted and was pushed to the side, causing my pillows to fly off and water bottles to crash to the floor. I clung to the sheets, paralyzed with fear, but no scream escaped my lips. The room felt suffocatingly silent. Eventually, I ran to my mum's room, terrified. Things got worse. I began hearing strange voices in my closet and noticing odd distortions in my phone's camera. One night, G, my friend, saw a dark figure in my closet peeking through the door on a FaceTime call. She said it sounded like me calling her name. That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. A spirit box session later revealed the name, George, and it seemed to be tied to the doll. My mum insisted I get rid of it, so I put it in a bag and left it near the back door. The next day, the bag was gone. My dad assumed it was trash and threw it away. After that, the strange occurrences stopped. The haunting ended when the doll was gone, but I'll never forget the terror it caused.
Story 9. Little girl's voice that stopped me in my tracks.
My friend used to work as a fire watcher at our old gym, which had been converted into a temporary school after our original school burned down in 2017. The building was notorious for being haunted, and although we weren't allowed to be there with him, we went every day to hang out. Even as teens and in our mid-20s, we would play hide and seek. Yes, you read that right. The gym had 4 levels: the basement, downstairs, the ground floor, and the upstairs. On this particular day, the lights were off, except for the lobby light. My friend went to count while the rest of us scattered to hide. I chose one of the creepiest spots, the employee bathroom. I wasn't brave enough to go deeper into the restroom, so I just stayed near the entrance, hoping no one would find me. After my friend finished counting, we all hid. One of my friends got caught, and I could hear shouting and the sound of running footsteps. Then, I heard something that froze me in place, an eerie, child's voice counting slowly from inside the bathroom. Keep in mind, there were at least 10 of us in the building, and I was the only one in the bathroom. The voice sounded like a young girl, maybe 5 or 8 years old, counting as if she were playing along with us. She counted slowly, 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time she reached 4, I was paralyzed with fear. The voice suddenly stopped. I stood frozen for a moment before gathering enough courage to walk out of the bathroom. I ran back to the home base, too scared to keep playing or even tag anyone else. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I miss those carefree days, but that experience still haunts me. I've never been able to explain it, but I know what I heard.
Story 10. The Demon in the Closet.
I am a 15-year-old girl struggling with a curse that has been haunting my family for generations. The curse originates from my mother's side of the family, who are from Ethiopia. My mother has shared terrifying stories from her childhood, recounting how she would see demonic figures and experience sleep paralysis. For as long as I can remember, I've suffered from these same afflictions, terrible headaches at least 5 times a week, and worse, I've been seeing things I can't explain. At night, when I'm feeling at my lowest, a recurring dream haunts me. In this dream, I hear a whisper in my ear, urging me to let it in. Every time, I wake up drenched in sweat, my body aching as if I've been fighting an invisible force. I've reached out to several people in the hopes of finding a solution, but nothing has worked. My mother's friend once traveled to Sudan, seeking answers from those who understood such curses. What they discovered was horrifying. Not only was my family cursed, but my mother had also been cursed by 4 other people, seemingly for no reason at all. Desperation set in when the people they consulted grew panicked, handing over strange items and rituals meant to break the curse, but none of them worked. Things only got worse after I was born. My mother told me about a terrifying experience she had after having me. One night, she dreamed of a dark, demonic figure that crawled over her and reached out to me. The next memory I have is from when I was a child. I was lying in bed near my mother when I saw something moving in the closet. It wasn't human, an unnaturally tall, thin figure with dark skin and glowing red eyes. It reached for me, its long fingers stretching toward me, but I couldn't move. My scream was drowned out by the terror gripping me. My mother tried to calm me, but we both saw the same thing in the bathroom. A tall, inhuman creature reaching toward me, taunting me. This curse, this entity, it seems to be growing stronger. I don't know how much longer I can endure it. I am desperate for help. If anyone knows what can be done, please, I need to know.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.